What's up guys, this is Pink Across. Today I'm going to be going over the checklist I use when team building in Gen 9 OU. All of these rules are going to apply to balanced teams, and when you get to the more extremes, hyper offense and stall, some of the rules will not be as applicable, and I will explain what those exceptions are. Let's get right into it. Number 1, resistance to all types. There is a hard hitter for every single type in OU, and if your team can't resist it, you are going to be having major problems. Now, some hyper offense teams can ignore this rule a little. Not much. Even hyper offense really should have a resistance to every type. But if you're a hyper offense team that doesn't have a resistance to like ice type per se, you know, it's really not the end of the world. Ice type, maybe poison type, these are not things that would get you in trouble. Now, especially with hyper offense though, if you don't have a resistance to a common priority type like grass for Rillaboom's Grassy Glide or electric for Raging Bolt, that's a major problem. But for every single team that's not hyper offense, you need a resistance to every type. Number 2, immunities to ground and electric. The reason you need always to have an immunity to electric is this move right here. Volt Switch, 70 base power, special move, non-contact. You are going to have major problems if you're a balanced team and you can't take a Volt Switch. Now, hyper offense can ignore this for the most part. Since hyper offense teams rarely switch and mostly just stay in and go for sweeps and sack Pokemon off, it doesn't really matter to them to get Volt Switched on, because the real disadvantage to getting Volt Switched on is that you switch and then your opponent gets an advantage on you. So if you have a hyper offense team that doesn't have an electric immunity, that's not the biggest deal, but all other teams really need to have an immunity to Volt Switch. And the reason for why you need a ground immunity is partly this move right here. Headlong Rush is extremely powerful, and Great Tusk has coverage that makes all of its other moves very scary as well, but also just the distribution of Earthquake. So if we look here, there are a lot of powerful Pokemon, and even if we just filter for ground types, but Earthquake is common coverage as well, there are so many strong ground types that are using Earthquake in OU, and this is a physical 100 accuracy non-contact move, so if you have no immunity to that, your team is going to be weak to Earthquake. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to a lot of these rules, like if you happen to have like 4 ground resists on a team, yeah, maybe you don't need to have a Levitate or Flying Pokemon, but for the most part, you absolutely need an electric immunity, and you almost always want a ground immunity as well. Number 3, Psychic Sponge. I say sponge because you don't necessarily need an immunity. Now, the best way to deal with all these would be a dark type, but even then, in the case of something like a Deoxys Speed, superpower can get you as well. But for the most part, Psychic has recently just gotten a lot of good new moves. The buffed Luster Purge on Latios, Future Sight has been a menace for a while, and Psycho Boost with Deoxys. So this could be something just like a Ting-Lu, or a Kingambit, but I wouldn't necessarily say you need a dark type. You could also run something like a Heatran, maybe Leftovers, especially defensive, would be able to take on these hits decently as well. Number 4, Hazard Control and Hazards. Some teams don't need hazards, but most do, and all teams need to consider opposing hazards. The only time you don't need any form of removal is either when you have a hyper offense team and you can put enough pressure on your opponent that they won't be able to stack up hazards on you. And even then, it would be often a good idea to have a Hatterene or a Great Tusk with booster energy or something to remove. But for a lot of other teams, everything balanced, offense, stall, you will need some good form of removal, or you can spam heavy duty boots. So that's another option. If you have some really good knockoff absorbers like Gliscor, Corviknight, and Clefable, and you have a bunch of heavy duty boots Pokemon, you can ignore the hazard war altogether. But for the most part, you do want to have something that can set hazards, at least Stealth Rock. You can have spikes if you want, but I would say most teams want at least one form of entry hazard. And as for the best forms of hazard control, these are my 2 favorite, Great Tusk and Cinderace here. Now, if your team is going to be more on the balance side or bulky balance, I would recommend Great Tusk, because over the course of a game, Cinderace can only really court change once. And if you don't have a team that's offensive enough to take advantage of that before your opponent just sets hazards again, you're going to be in a bad spot. So it's good to run Great Tusk. You can run both of these on a team. They work pretty well together. Now, there are some more niche options for hazard removal. You've got Mousehold and Cincino here with Tidy Up, and some other more niche rapid spin users like Excadrill and Iron Treads. So those are options as well, but for the most part, you're going to want to use these 2, Great Tusk and Cinderace. Number 5, subscribe to my channel. If you don't subscribe to my channel, an army of Wooper will come and take all of your good teams. Please subscribe to prevent this tragedy. And now for the actual number 5, immediate power. It's important to have immediate power so your team isn't vulnerable to bulky, powerful Pokemon or setup sweepers. Generally, it just makes your team a lot more passive if you don't have anything that's immediately strong. A great example is a modest Choice Specs Dragapult or Choice Specs Kyurem, and it doesn't necessarily have to be choiced. You could also run something that just has a lot of natural power, like an Ogerpon Cornerstone. That, with its high base power moves and item, becomes a very threatening Pokemon immediately. Now, here are some examples of what is not immediate power. A Serperior, although it may be threatening and it may become extremely powerful very quickly, it is not immediate. It cannot hit hard on the first turn. Another bad example is Roaring Moon. So this Pokemon can hit hard immediately, but only the first time it comes in due to booster energy. You may want to bring in your immediate power many times during a game, and having a one-time usage is not a good idea. Now, if this was a Choice Band Roaring Moon, it would be a great example. Hyper Offense often doesn't need to have immediate power since it can threaten with constant setup, and it's usually structured to prevent the opponent from having opportunities to get things going like setup, and it doesn't worry too much about breakers since Hyper Offense doesn't mind sacking Pokemon. This is also not needed by stall teams since they'll entirely be focused on walling out the opponent and won't have any power at all. Number 6, guaranteed progress. Your team should have some way to break anything if given enough time. Now, there's a stall for every team, and you won't actually be able to break absolutely everything, but you should be able to break most stall teams. That's the standard you should hold your teams to. If they can break stall, they can break balance, they can break offense, they can break anything. Now, there are a lot of Pokemon that help out with this. Galarian Slowking is really great, and there are a lot of powerful choiced Pokemon that make stall breaking easy. Choice Banded Samurott is exceptional. Choice Specs Goldengo is as well. With Hazard support, even an Assault Vestupa can break stall. I will have a video linked in the description that explains how to break stall in Gen 9. I would highly recommend watching it if you're noticing you're having difficulties with that matchup. But for the most part, you just need to make sure your team has some way to make guaranteed progress. The one exception to this is stall. It's good for stall to have a way to make likely progress, but just because of the constraints of stall team building this generation, you usually have to rely on your opponent having a somewhat more balanced or offensive team to have a reliable way to break them. If you're using stall and your opponent has a bulky team as well, there's probably nothing you can do. Number 7, priority and speed control. The one playstyle that doesn't have to worry about this is stall. Even on hyper offense, you really want to have priority, and especially on balanced teams. With Terra and all the new sweepers that have been added to the tier, there is no possible way you can keep track of everything. Fortunately, we do have a lot of good options for priority. The big 4 are Rillaboom, Raging Bolt with Thunderclap, Kingambit, and Dragonite. So these are the ones you mainly want to use. And I would say priority is actually more important than speed control right now. Mainly because using Terra, Pokemon can usually boost up their speed enough so that even the fastest Pokemon in the tier aren't able to outspeed. So I would say it's ideal to have both, but if you can only fit one, I would optimize the priority before I would optimize the speed control. And the best ones are the ones that are not conditional. So Rillaboom and Dragonite can click Extreme Speed and Grassy Glide whether the opponent attacks or not. Thunderclap and Sucker Punch are very vulnerable to Substitute, so those are kind of your secondary priority Pokemon, although they're still exceptional. Speed control is very important to have as well, though. Some things like Dragapult and Deoxys Speed are really good examples. Weavile and Meowscarada are a few others that are very good. It's good to have something fast on your team, and sometimes your priority won't be able to hit something very effectively, so it's good to have something fast that can pack a punch. Number 8, Knockoff. Knockoff is an exceptional move for every playstyle. The only playstyle that can afford not to run it, I'd say, is Hyper Offense, but even Hyper Offense usually appreciates having a knockoff Pokemon. These are some of my favorite knockoff users in the tier. I think all of these are very effective, and generally the great thing about knockoff is that for at least one time in a game, you don't have to predict. You can click knockoff and you can remove something's item, which is really, really good. Items are a major part of the game, removing them is fantastic. And even if you have several knockoff users that pressure different things, you can usually remove several items, which is amazing as well. If you're not running knockoff, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage because your opponent probably is. Number 9, pivoting moves. These are some of my favorite pivots in Gen 9 OU. It's really, really good to have pivots on your team because it basically eases prediction on your part a lot. Now, this should not be used too much on hyper offense or stall. Stall doesn't really care about pivoting because it can just switch into a bulky Pokemon anyway, and it doesn't have any momentum to begin with. Hyper offense doesn't want to switch out, and it would rather stay in and try to maximize whichever sweeper is currently on the field. But everything in between, from bulky balance to offense, should absolutely be using a lot of pivot moves. It's going to make the game feel a lot easier to play, and if you're facing a team that has a lot more pivoting moves than you, you'll probably feel like you're working a lot harder. Predicting is hard, clicking U-turn is easy, so run it. Number 10, some response to common threats. I say some response because you're going to get swept by Volcarona sometimes, you're going to get swept by Superior sometimes, we all are, but you should have some response, some hope or way of dealing with something. Even though it's not going to be completely reliable, you cannot have a team that can check every set of Roaring Moon, Volcarona, Superior, and Volcarona and Gouging Fire. It's just not possible. But what you can do is have sets and priority moves and Terra types that at least give you potential outs. So this is a list of the Pokemon I think most commonly people forget to prepare for. Is Roaring Moon, Volcarona, Gouging Fire, Superior, and another surprising one, I know most of these have been sweepers thus far, but a lot of people forget to prep for Gliscor as well. They just have a team where nothing really beats it or challenges it, and that's as big of a problem as forgetting one of these sweepers. And another one is Walking Wake. So there are a lot more that people forget to prep for, but make sure to watch out for these and anything else. I would recommend when you finish a team, just going through the tier, or maybe when you're in the final building stages of a team. Just go through the tier. It doesn't have that many Pokemon. You can just check and quickly see what do I lose to. And if there you see something, note it, write it down, and adjust your team. You're going to have difficult matchups, but if you absolutely straight up lose to a Pokemon, that's not a good sign, and it indicates further weaknesses to your team. One honorable mention that I wouldn't say is necessarily a requirement, but is very good to have, is something that can punish contact moves. Triple Axle, Weavile, and Meowscarada are becoming a lot more popular in the tier, so having something like a Flame Body Heatran, a Static Zapdos, Rocky Helmet Garchomp, Volcarona with Flame Body, or something like that to dissuade them from using those moves and punish them if they do, is a really nice thing to have. Now you can get by without it, but I would say a lot of the best teams have some way of punishing those contact moves. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you're interested, I offer one-on-one tutoring, and you can find the link to sign up in the description. I'll see you guys next time.